Welcome to Honeybee Watch Symposia series. This is our third event and the last of 2023. I'm Steve Rogenstein. I'm your host and the behind-the-scenes producer and Honeybee Watch's project director. And I'm joined by Arrigo Moro, who is our science director. And today we'll hear from 4 experts who will share their research projects and experiences with free-living bees. And today in particular, we're going to talk about wild, a term that is laden with connotations and controversy. So the purpose of the Symposia series is manyfold. As I said, it's an international coalition. What we're trying to do is bring experts together to introduce them to one another, to start and spark dialogue, to introduce you to them and their projects, and you to one another. It's also a platform whereby we can hear about different experiences and perspectives related to free-living colonies and to discuss individual issues. So in the past, we spoke about monitoring. In September, we also talked about data sharing and data rights. And today, we're going to talk about wild. So today's title is Wild, Free-Living, Feral, Definitions for Consistency. And each of these terms has sparked numerous discussions, and we have not come to any clear conclusions. And so in this dialogue today, we really wanted to get to the heart of what is wild. It seems easy enough, but unfortunately it isn't. Today we'll attempt to unravel why and maybe work towards a clearer understanding and a clearer usage of this term. And through a couple of brief illustrations in no particular order, I'm hoping to introduce the complexity and some of the controversies. So to begin, we interchange wild living with free living. Some people use one of the terms and the other. They're interchangeable as we see it, but these are distinct from feral. So feral often refers to escapees. But in this context, if a swarm from a managed apiary settles into a tree cavity, for instance, while we acknowledge that it's a feral colony, until when is it? Does it ever revert back to being in a wild state? And who defines this process? And this is something that we have discussed interminably and have not really come to any kind of resolution. Additionally, as I said, we've been working with IUCN. And in 2014, they gave the data deficient label to Apis mellifera. And the reason was because there were complications between wild and domesticated. And, IUCN, they're working with animals across the globe. And when you're talking about a whale or a rhinoceros, yes, if seen in nature, it's wild. But in the case of honeybees, many view them as a species that's incapable of surviving without human interventions. And obviously we challenge that. You can't control their reproduction. You can't control what they feed on or where they forage. And so this dichotomy of wild versus domesticated doesn't quite apply to Apis mellifera. Some people instead use managed as the opposite to wild, but again, we don't have a universally accepted definition here. So going back to wild, are we talking about a colony on an individual basis? Is it an entire population? And if we're talking about wild populations, are these self-sustaining, whereby they're isolated from managed hives that could cast swarms and possibly dilute genetics? And then what happens when a wild population exists, but not in its original geographic range? Is this considered wild also? Something else? Does it deserve protection? And then in common parlance, wild bees these days is often associated with solitary bees. And the question is, can honeybees be wild too, or do they beg a new descriptor? So this is just a couple of examples of topics that we've been pondering at Honeybee Watch. And while many have addressed these, for instance, Vincent Ambouy, I don't know if he's here today, or Francis Cordelot, they're drafting a glossary of terms, but there are no universal answers yet. And obviously within science, it's important for us to come to consensus so that we have consistent definitions, to know that we're talking about the same concepts and that population characteristics specifically are referred to universally. So that's a lot to process, but those are kind of the topics that we're going to discuss today. I could go on and on, but we're really here for our guests. So Hannes is an engineer by trade, but currently is studying biology because he hopes to work again in research again, ideally with wild bees. In Sweden, he founded a beekeeping association in 2020 to improve conditions for honeybees, with them as the focus, not beekeepers. He's been a beekeeper for 10 years, and his arc started conventionally, like it did for many of us. However, he's transitioned away from that towards a gentler style of apiculture and rewilding. And giving credit where credit is due, he was a catalyst for the Symposia series. In 2021, he proposed that we co-host a discussion about monitoring and the importance of a glossary. And it was so well attended that we realized, hey, there's an audience for these kind of explorations. And so we materialized the Symposia series. So Hannes, thank you for being the spark of inspiration for us. Without further ado, I'd like to present you the floor. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Go for it.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. I'm glad to be here. Yeah, those pictures are the nests, or a couple of those that I'm following here in Sweden with wild colonies in it. And one year I was lucky enough to see one of those colonies cast swarms. And that was one of the most wonderful experiences I had with the bees. To see the scouts on the swarms and to follow it into the new nest. The radio came by and made a really nice report, but then some expert called in and said, "Excuse me, but," or something like that. "Excuse me, but wild bees don't swarm." And the radio just ran with it without contacting me. They went on air saying, all we've said before was wrong because wild bees are solitary bees and bumblebees, and they don't swarm. So that turned this wonderful experience also into one of the worst I've had with the bees. And I can say I don't really agree with with that distinction. Of course, Steve mentioned it already. As Tom Thiele and many others have explained quite convincingly, the honeybee is not fully domesticated, and also you can find it in the wild in Sweden as well. And then there is the case that you have bumblebees in breeding operations, commercial pollination, and even solitary beekeeping has become a thing, if you could call it like that. So I would say the lines are rather blurred between those three types of bees. This doesn't work to call one of them wild, or two of them wild and the other not. A common definition, which is kind of the basis for that view, I believe, is a genetic focus of wilds, a genotypic wild, one could call it. And that would be when the genetic material of a colony is shaped by anything but selective breeding. But there's a problem with this because the queens and drones mate over large distances, and swarms can be caught by beekeepers, and beekeeper swarms can escape apiaries. So the wild aren't really genetically wild. They are intergressed with genes from domestication, which gives us this kind of unsatisfying semi-wild or semi-domesticated for those two cases. So that doesn't really help to distinguish the two. Interestingly, though, because they are genetically similar due to that gene flow, you can swap the two definitions, which I will get back to in a minute. What I meant with wild on radio also is kind of a phenotypic definition, phenotype are the observable traits, so that the colonies observable traits are caused by anything but management by humans, and those observable traits would be like the size and shape of a colony and its behavior, and the products of behavior, like how much propolis is collected and so on. And that would give us a very nice and clear distinction between the wild bees and the managed bees in apiaries. So that certainly helps to distinguish the two. And one goal why one would do that is obviously to protect the wild ones, because they are wild. They may deserve protection. But I see a bit of a risk with this, because it creates a gap or a barrier between the two, and genetically they are very similar, and that may actually be a problem depending on what goal one has. So to drive it a bit to the top, one could say we have rich and poor bees. We would be creating some kind of a two-class society of bees here. We would have the rich bees live in their monumental castles, big massive trees, eating the finest honey, and being protected from evil humans. And then on the other hand, we have the poor bees that live in their ghettos in the cheapest plastic houses with mold in the corners. So they're fed junk food and they're exploited and even killed by their owners. So that's kind of disturbing. I think if you would promote, by a definition, if you promote this kind of picture, it would certainly not convince a beekeeper to change things. I think it could actually alienate beekeepers. But again, it depends on what the goal is. Is the ultimate goal to protect the wild? Then that may work. Not everywhere. I'll get to that, but I have more goals, or another ultimate goal than to protect the wild, or another way to say it is I protect the wild because I want to achieve something else. And one of those goals is a form of sustainability. For the bees, that would be not to jeopardize the honeybees' chances to persist without management by humans. And for that, it may actually be helpful to use the genetic definition, because they are genetically the same or very similar. They are both semi-wild, and that could be an incentive for beekeepers to treat them differently if they understand that they're still capable of self-sustained life. They don't need management practices. Then one could change one's methods, and also the methods one applies could actually lead to domestication, which would not be, which may not be the goal of every beekeeper. So that this genetic definition may have its merits in this case as well. Sustainability, Steve mentioned it also. There's often, or I believe is often a thought or a view that sustainability is achieved as soon as one stops treating the bees. So that is, if that is somehow the goal. But I would say it's more complicated, unfortunately. Like my apiary here on the right, even if I wouldn't treat the bees there, it's not a sustainable situation there, and that's because of two factors. I would say two main factors are important for sustainability. and one is the evolution of the pests or pathogens and parasites, and the other is the evolution of the bees. In the apiaries, we have a predominantly horizontal transfer of pathogens and parasites, and that leads to the evolution of higher virulence and more dangerous diseases and parasites. So that needs to change. We need to swap to vertical disease transmission, because that leads to the evolution of kind enemies, so to speak. And the other part, the bees evolution, if beekeepers continuously prevent swarming and propagate the colonies by themselves, then swarming will degenerate by mutations. It can take a long time, but that's what the evolutionary mechanism would be, so that the bees would no longer be capable to sustain themselves in a situation without management. And that's actually a problem in—
You have one minute.
Thank you. That's actually a problem in countries like Sweden, where I believe there are very few wild bees and very many apiaries. I wouldn't be surprised if we would have in Sweden 10 times more beekeepers than wild colonies. So in that case, whatever we do with the wild bees, however we protect them directly, will not protect them from the gene flow from domestication. So we would have to focus our work or get some sort of synergy effects from the work with the wild bees, so that the conditions in the apiaries are improved, so that the bees can be self-sustaining. Thank you. That was my presentation.
Hannes, you were exactly on time. So thank you for keeping us on schedule. Super interesting. I love how you're setting it up with bringing in the genetics. It's an issue that we've been facing a lot, which is how do you show that wild honeybees are genetically different than managed bees? It's super complicated. And another thing that you said is, could this lead to change management? And this is something that we strive for at Honeybee Watch, probably in the 5-10 year kind of goals, which is using the science to hopefully improve beekeeping practices to make them more sustainable, and or what can we learn from the bees that are free living and transfer that knowledge to people in the beekeeping community.